In front of a silent crowd, the unthinkable happened. A hardened biker leader, a man feared by many, fell to his knees with tears streaming down his face. And who was he thanking? Not another outlaw, but a broke veteran named Jack, his little daughter Emily, and their loyal dog Rex. This was the moment that shook an entire brotherhood, and it all began on a stormy night when fire consumed a trailer and one man chose to run toward the flames. If you believe stories like this reveal the quiet strength of the human heart, tell me where in the world you are watching from and share how this moment makes you feel. Leave a like to support stories of courage and compassion, and may your day be filled with hope and kindness. The rain had been falling since late afternoon, a steady curtain of water that turned the narrow streets of Riverbend into ribbons of glistening black glass. By the time Jack Carter guided his pickup down the familiar road toward his mother-in-law's house, night had fully claimed the small town, wrapping it in mist and shadow. Jack, a 42-year-old veteran with a weathered face and the calm presence of a man who had known hardship, pulled up to the curb and saw a light flicker in the window. Emily, his 5-year-old daughter, came running out with a small backpack slung over one shoulder, her golden hair tied in messy pigtails, cheeks flushed with the warmth of the house she had just left. At his side, Rex, a 6-year-old German Shepherd K9, sat upright in the passenger seat, his sharp amber eyes scanning the night as if danger could emerge from any shadow. Jack lifted Emily into the back seat, adjusting her seatbelt with careful hands, and Rex jumped down to stretch his strong legs, shaking the rain from his black and tan coat before leaping back into place. They had only just started the drive home when the night split with a sound so raw and piercing that Jack instinctively pressed the brake. It wasn't the wail of sirens, nor the crack of thunder. It was a scream, high and desperate, the kind of cry that came when life itself was on the brink. Jack turned his head, searching the darkness, and saw the glow that didn't belong. Orange flames licking up the side of a battered trailer at the end of the road, sparks twisting into the wet air as if the storm itself had no power to smother them. Emily gasped, her small hands pressed to the glass as her wide blue eyes reflected the blaze. "Daddy," she whispered, but before the fear could root itself too deep, Jack was already pulling the truck onto the shoulder. He opened the door, his boots splashing into muddy water, and motioned for Emily to stay put. Rex, sensing urgency, leapt out beside him, ears pricked, muscles taut. The air reeked of burning wood and plastic, each gust of wind carrying smoke that clawed at Jack's throat. He turned back briefly, crouching to Emily's eye level through the open door. "Stay here, sweetheart. Don't move. Keep the doors locked." Her lip trembled, but she nodded, clutching Rex's leash, even though the dog had already bounded toward the fire with a low growl. The trailer was old, its metal siding warped with age, the small front porch barely holding together under the weight of years. Flames surged out of broken windows, painting the rain in streaks of red and gold. Jack yanked at the front door, but it held stubbornly, locked or jammed by heat. He cursed under his breath, scanning quickly, his soldier's mind calculating options. In the driveway sat a rusted pickup truck piled with discarded tools and scraps of metal. He grabbed a tire iron, the cold steel slick with rain, and swung hard at the nearest window. Glass exploded outward, shards raining down as the fire inside hissed angrily at the intrusion. Without hesitation, Jack hauled himself up, his forearms slicing against the jagged frame, warm blood mixing with rainwater, and dropped into the smoke-filled chaos. Inside, the world dissolved into suffocating heat and choking darkness. Smoke wrapped itself around him like a living thing, clawing into his lungs, blinding his eyes. He dropped to his knees, crawling low, one hand sweeping before him as he shouted hoarsely into the void. His voice was swallowed almost instantly, but then, a cough, small and ragged to his right. Jack pivoted, heart hammering, until his hand found flesh. A woman, mid-30s, her skin hot from the fire, clutching a child to her chest. Her face was streaked with soot, hair matted to her cheeks, eyes wide with terror. "Help us," she rasped, barely audible. Jack shifted, wrapping one arm under her shoulder, the other securing the girl she held, perhaps 7 years old, thin and trembling with fear. With all his strength, he half-dragged, half-carried them back toward the broken window, each step through the smoke a battle against his own weakening body. Outside, Emily pressed her face to the glass of the truck, tears forming as she watched the orange inferno devour the trailer. She could see shadows moving inside, could hear Rex barking frantically, the deep, urgent sound of a dog who knew life was at stake. When Jack reappeared at the window, hauling two figures behind him, Emily clapped her hands to her mouth, her heart pounding with relief. The woman and child tumbled out first, coughing violently, collapsing into the rain-soaked grass. Jack shoved them toward safety, his chest heaving, before vanishing back inside without hesitation. Rex had already found the next soul in peril. In a far corner, nearly hidden beneath a fallen beam, lay a boy no older than Emily, perhaps 5, his face streaked with tears and soot, a red bandana tied around his tiny wrist. Rex barked, sharp and commanding, teeth clamped onto the boy's sleeve, tugging him free from debris. The child coughed weakly, eyes glassy with fear, but the dog didn't relent. Jack stumbled through the haze, his arms outstretched until they closed around the boy's fragile frame. "I've got you, buddy," Jack murmured, voice hoarse, pulling the boy against his chest, wrapping him inside his soaked flannel shirt as if his body alone could shield the child from the flames. The roof groaned above, a terrible sound like the earth itself cracking open. Jack's instincts screamed at him to move. He charged toward the window, lungs burning, every muscle straining. Rex darted beside him, barking furiously, urging him on. The frame of the window loomed ahead, the only escape left. Jack lunged through, clutching the boy to his chest as the ceiling collapsed behind him in a shower of sparks and smoke. They tumbled into the mud outside, the boy still pressed tight in Jack's arms, Rex skidding to a halt beside them, soaked and trembling but alive. For a moment, the world was only rain and fire, the hiss of water on flames, the gasps of those who had been saved. Jack lay on the ground, chest heaving, his arm bleeding from the gash at the window, but his grip on the boy never loosened. The mother and daughter he had rescued clung to each other nearby, sobbing into the storm. Emily ran forward then, small arms wrapping around Rex's wet fur, her face buried against his neck as the dog licked her cheek with frantic affection. Jack sat up slowly, coughing hard, eyes burning from smoke, and looked down at the boy in his arms, alive though barely conscious. The bandana at his wrist stood out like a mark of fate. Neighbors began to gather at a distance, their silhouettes outlined by firelight, murmurs spreading through the crowd. Some stood frozen, others whispered prayers, all bearing witness to what they had just seen. Jack Carter, the quiet veteran no one really knew, had walked into a burning house and brought 3 souls out alive. Rex, loyal and unflinching, had stood with him every step. And Emily, though small and fragile, had shown a courage of her own, waiting, watching, trusting that her father and her dog would emerge from the fire. In the storm's relentless downpour, Jack tightened his arms around the boy one last time, pressing his face into the child's damp hair as if to anchor himself to the living proof that his sacrifice had not been in vain. Around them, the trailer collapsed fully, a roar of flame surrendering to the rain, sparks rising into the night like ghosts finally released. The chapter of fire was over, but the weight of what had happened would follow them long after the rain stopped falling. The fire was over, but its smoke still lingered in Jack Carter's lungs as the night gave way to a dim, gray morning. In the sterile brightness of Riverbend Memorial Hospital, the chaos of the storm felt distant, replaced by the sharp scent of disinfectant and the low hum of fluorescent lights. Jack sat on the edge of a narrow cot, his arm bandaged where glass had torn his flesh, ribs taped where the smoke and strain had left him coughing blood. Rex lay at his feet, the 6-year-old German Shepherd K9 resting his massive head on his paws, his black and tan fur damp but brushed clean, his amber eyes alert even in exhaustion. Emily, small and pale from a night of fear, leaned against Jack's side, her hand gripping the fabric of his jacket as if letting go might make him vanish into the white corridors. The nurses had been kind, but brisk, efficient in a way that left little space for tenderness. They checked Jack's vitals, cleaned his wounds, and wrapped him in gauze. Rex had been given a once-over too, a young veterinary assistant summoned from the shelter across the street to inspect his paws and ears. Aside from a scorched patch of fur and a limp in his right leg, Rex was unharmed, his body as resilient as his spirit. Emily had been given warm cocoa and a blanket, her blonde hair brushed back by a nurse who smiled and whispered that her father was brave. Jack had thanked them all, but inside he carried a heaviness that bandages could not cover, the weight of fire and screams that clung to his memory. When at last the paperwork was finished and the stitches tightened, Jack rose carefully, his breath shallow against the tape that held his ribs in place. Emily took his hand, her small palm trembling against his rough, calloused skin. Rex padded faithfully beside them, nails clicking against the linoleum floor, tail low but wagging faintly at the sight of daylight ahead. They walked together down the hall, their pace slow but steady, and pushed open the heavy glass doors that led out into the hospital courtyard. The storm had passed, leaving puddles across the pavement that mirrored the pale sun now breaking through. For a fleeting moment, Jack thought they might slip back quietly into the ordinary world. But then it came, the sound that shattered stillness like thunder rolling over the town. Engines, deep and unrelenting, the growl of a dozen Harleys tearing through the quiet streets of Riverbend. The rumble vibrated in Jack's bones, made Emily clutch his hand tighter, made Rex lift his head sharply, ears pricked, a low warning growl escaping his throat. People turned, patients in wheelchairs paused, nurses stepped outside to look, and from around the corner, they came. A wall of chrome and leather, sunlight glinting off polished steel as the roar grew louder. At their head rode a man who could not be mistaken, his presence commanding even before his boots touched the ground. Cole Walker dismounted with the weight of a man who carried both authority and pain. In his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick beard streaked with gray and tattoos curling up his neck like inked flames, he was every inch the image of a biker leader. His black leather vest bore patches that spoke of rank and history, scars stitched not only into fabric but into his hardened expression. Yet today, his eyes were bloodshot, his jaw trembling, his hands unsteady. He was not a man feared in this moment. He was only a father who had almost lost his son. Behind him, dozens of bikers dismounted too, men and women alike, their faces roughened by sun and road, their eyes fixed on the family before them. The crowd around the hospital stilled, holding its breath as if sensing something greater than spectacle was about to unfold. Jack stood, instinctively shifting Emily behind him, though not in fear, more in reflex, a soldier's habit. Rex braced at his side, the fur along his spine rising slightly, though his gaze remained steady on the leader approaching. Cole's boots splashed through puddles as he closed the distance, each step heavy, deliberate, as though carrying the weight of an ocean on his shoulders. He stopped only when he was a breath away, his rough hands reaching out, and before Jack could react, those hands seized his. The grip was not crushing, not meant to dominate, but trembling, desperate. Cole's face broke then, the walls he had built over years on the road collapsing in a flood of raw emotion. With a voice that cracked under the strain, Cole whispered, "You saved my boy." His eyes locked with Jack's, but then they darted downward as a sound rose from behind the small cough, the stirring of a child. Landon, just freed from danger, had been carried out earlier by paramedics, stabilized and placed on a stretcher near the entrance. His eyelids fluttered open now, a soft groan escaping his lips, and the sight undid Cole completely. The man who had never bowed to anyone in his life suddenly faltered. His knees buckled, and before anyone could catch him, he dropped to the ground beside his son. The gasp from the crowd was audible. Dozens of voices sucked into silence as Cole knelt there, his large frame shaking, tears cutting clean paths down his soot-streaked face. He gathered Landon into his arms, clutching the boy against his chest with a ferocity that no fire could burn away. His shoulders heaved as sobs tore through him, unashamed and unrestrained, the sound echoing across the courtyard like a confession no man ever expected to hear from him. "Thank you," he choked, turning his wet eyes back to Jack. "Thank you for bringing him back to me. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Rex." Emily, still half hidden behind Jack, stared wide-eyed, unsure what to do, her small body pressed against her father's leg. Rex, sensing the shift, moved forward a step, his tail sweeping low, his head tilted as if acknowledging the gratitude in his own way. Jack, standing above them, felt the enormity of the moment pressing against his chest. He had not gone into the fire for recognition, had not carried the boy through smoke to earn a place in anyone's story. But here, before dozens of witnesses, the leader of a feared brotherhood knelt in tears, his gratitude laid bare for the world to see. The other bikers stood in silence, their leather vests gleaming in the morning sun, their tattooed arms crossed or hanging limp at their sides. Hardened men and women who had seen violence and loss bowed their heads slightly, not in shame, but in respect. Some blinked back tears themselves, others simply watched, their expressions unreadable. The hospital staff, patients and onlookers held still, as if caught in the gravity of something sacred. For a brief stretch of time, The roar of engines, the sting of smoke, the sting of the night before, all of it seemed to fall away. There was only this: a father's tears, a child's weak breath, and the bond forged by a man who had chosen not to walk away. Jack reached down then, resting a steadying hand on Cole's shoulder. He did not speak, because there were no words that could carry the weight of the fire, no sentence that could encapsulate what had been shared in the smoke. His silence was answer enough. Cole nodded through his tears, clutching his son tighter, his rough voice breaking once more as he said, "I owe you everything." The words drifted into the crowd, absorbed by every witness, carved into memory. When Cole finally rose, Landon cradled in his arms, he was not diminished. If anything, his tears had made him more formidable in the eyes of those watching. Not as a leader of bikers, but as a man unashamed to love his child with a fierceness that humbled even the hardest of hearts. He turned once more to Jack, Emily, and Rex, his gratitude etched deep into his face, and then he walked slowly back toward the line of engines waiting at the curb. The others followed, their boots echoing on the wet pavement, leaving behind a silence heavy with awe. Jack stood still, Emily's hand clasped in his, Rex leaning against his leg. For the first time since the fire, Jack exhaled fully, a breath that felt like release. Around him, the crowd began to disperse, whispers rising, eyes lingering. But the memory of Cole Walker's tears would not fade. It was a moment seared into the heart of Riverbend, a moment that said more about family and gratitude than any speech could. The days after the fire passed slowly, each morning arriving with the same weight of exhaustion that no sleep could fully erase. Riverbend's air had cleared of smoke, but in Jack Carter's modest home on the edge of town, the memory of heat and screams lingered like a shadow no rain could wash away. Emily clung to her father more than usual, waking in the night to pad across the creaking floorboards, just to curl against him with her favorite blanket. Rex, ever the guardian, slept by the door, his massive frame curled but his ears always alert, the scars of flame still faintly singed into patches of his thick black and tan coat. Jack tried to keep life steady, brewing coffee in the mornings, reading Emily bedtime stories at night, but beneath his calm there was a tension, an awareness that something had shifted, and it would not shift back. It was on the fourth morning, when the air carried the crisp bite of autumn, that Jack opened his front door to find something waiting on the step. A small package, plain brown paper, no name, no address. For a man used to mail filled only with bills and notices, the sight was strange enough to make him pause. Rex sniffed at it first, tail low, nose twitching with curiosity, while Emily peeked around her father's leg with wide eyes. Jack crouched, lifting the package carefully, the weight of it firm but not heavy, and carried it inside. The three of them gathered around the kitchen table, the morning light spilling in through sheer curtains as Jack slit the tape with a pocket knife. Inside lay something simple yet startling: a silver pin gleaming against the brown paper. Its shape was clean and purposeful, a wing curling protectively around three engraved letters, AFFA. Beneath it rested a photograph slightly smudged at the corners, showing Landon smiling, gap-toothed, his small hand lifted in a cheerful thumbs up. Across the back of the photo, written in thick black marker, were the words, "He still talks about you and Rex." Jack's breath caught, his fingers tightening around the edges of the photo. Emily leaned forward, her little hands lifting the pin carefully, holding it up to the light. The silver caught the sun, dazzling her eyes. "What does it mean, Daddy?" she asked softly, her voice filled with awe. Rex sat close, ears perked, eyes locked on the object as if he too understood its gravity. Jack had no ready answer. He knew enough to recognize the letters, "Angels Forever." Forever Angels, a motto whispered with reverence in the biker world. But why it had been left here, in his hands, was a question that knotted in his chest. Before he could form words, there came a knock at the door, heavy but not hostile. Emily jumped, clutching the pin tightly, while Rex moved toward the sound, his nails tapping against the floor, his body braced but not aggressive. Jack rose, opening the door cautiously, and there stood Cole Walker, his broad figure filling the frame, with Landon at his side. Cole's appearance was less intimidating in daylight. His beard was trimmed, though streaked with gray. His leather vest still carried patches, but his shirt beneath was clean, sleeves rolled to reveal strong forearms inked with tattoos that spoke of battles won and losses endured. His face bore the lines of sleepless nights, yet his eyes softened the moment they fell on Emily clutching the pin. Landon, 5 years old, with sandy brown hair and the same red bandana tied loosely at his wrist, stood close to his father's leg, his gaze shy but eager. He wore a blue t-shirt, a size too big, jeans scuffed at the knees, sneakers muddied from play. When he saw Rex, his face lit with recognition, and he took a small step forward, his smile timid but genuine. "I thought it was better to say this in person," Cole began, his voice rough but steady. He glanced at Jack, then at the pin on the table. "That isn't charity. It isn't a favor. It's recognition. You stepped into the fire for one of ours. And when someone saves family, they become family." His eyes dropped briefly, the weight of the words pulling him quiet before he added, "This is what AFFA means. Angels forever, forever. Angels, it's not a title you wear, it's a bond you've earned." Jack stood silent, his hands resting on the back of Emily's chair, his mind turning over Cole's words. He hadn't entered the flames for this, hadn't carried Landon out to claim a place among bikers, yet the sincerity in Cole's voice left little room for denial. Emily looked between the men, her small fingers tracing the letters on the pin, her face filled with curiosity. "Does this mean Daddy is one of you now?" she asked innocently. Cole's mouth twitched into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, but his voice softened as he replied, "It means your father will never stand alone." Landon stepped forward then, his hand fidgeting at his side, his gaze darting toward Emily. "I remember you," he said quietly, his voice hoarse from the smoke but filled with the candor of a child. "You were outside with Rex. He barked until I could hear where to go." Emily blinked, surprised, then smiled shyly, her cheeks pink. "Rex is really smart," she said, reaching down to pat the dog's head. Rex wagged his tail, leaning into her touch, then turned his head to nudge Landon's hand as if inviting him to join. Landon laughed softly, his fingers curling into the thick fur, the tension between the children melting into a bond born from shared survival. The adults watched in silence as Emily and Landon began to talk in the halting, curious way only children can about toys and favorite colors, about the fire they didn't fully understand, about how brave Rex had been. Cole's eyes glistened as he watched his son laugh, his voice lowering as he said to Jack, "He hasn't smiled like that since his mother passed. You gave him more than his life back. You gave him a piece of childhood he almost lost forever." Jack swallowed, his throat tight, words unspoken but understood. He reached down, brushing Emily's shoulder lightly, grounding himself in the small warmth of her presence. For a long while, the four of them sat together in that modest kitchen, the pin gleaming between them on the table. Emily and Landon played with Rex, tossing him a ball, giggling when he returned it with slobbery determination. Cole and Jack shared coffee, their conversation sparse but heavy with meaning, two fathers bound by an unspoken recognition of what it meant to protect a child at all costs. Outside, the autumn sun crept higher, the world moving on, but inside the house, something had shifted. The package had not just carried a symbol, it had carried a bridge. When Cole and Landon finally rose to leave, the moment lingered. Emily pressed the photo of Landon back into his small hands, whispering, "You can bring it next time." Landon nodded, smiling, his eyes bright with the kind of trust only children can give freely. Cole clasped Jack's hand firmly before stepping out the door, his gratitude unvoiced this time, but no less powerful. As the rumble of a single Harley faded into the distance, Jack looked down at the pin Emily still held, her eyes shining with wonder. Rex sat beside her, his gaze fixed on the emblem, tail thumping once against the floor, as though he too knew that a new chapter had quietly begun. The bond forged by fire had only just begun to steady when the next storm arrived. Riverbend, still humming with the whispers of that night, turned its attention elsewhere. But for Jack Carter, Emily, and Rex, life had shifted into a fragile new rhythm. Cole Walker, grateful beyond words, had included Jack and his family in small ways, an invitation to a meal, a handshake from one of the bikers, the sight of Landon laughing alongside Emily. Yet peace in their world never lasted long. On a brisk Saturday morning, the hum of engines filled the streets again. Not in menace, but in hope, as the angels rode in a charity convoy delivering toys to an orphanage. It was supposed to be simple, joyous, but fate rarely asked permission. The convoy had been halfway across town when a truck barreled through a red light. Witnesses later said it happened too fast, a blur of rusted metal and blaring horns. Cole's Harley took the hit head-on, the roar of impact drowning out every other sound. His body flew from the seat, his leather vest crumpling as he landed hard against asphalt, motionless. Chaos exploded. Bikes swerved, engines cut, voices shouted. When the dust settled, Cole was being lifted onto a stretcher, blood running down his temple, his chest frighteningly still. Landon had been waiting at the orphanage with Emily, his hands clutching the toy he meant to give away, his face pale as news reached him. For Jack, the moment felt like war again, the sudden violence, the helpless rush of memory, and once more he found himself stepping forward without thought. At Riverbend Memorial Hospital, the waiting room became a vigil. Dozens of bikers filled the seats and lined the walls, their leather vests heavy with patches, their silence deafening. These were men and women hardened by the road, used to blood and bruises, yet they stood here like lost children, hands clenched, jaws tight, unable to breach the line between brotherhood and grief. Jack moved among them, quiet but constant, his presence neither commanding nor timid, simply steady. Emily, clutching a basket of sandwiches she and her grandmother had prepared, handed them out shyly, her small voice soft but brave as she offered food to men twice her size. Rex lay near Landon's chair, his massive head resting on the boy's knee, his amber eyes lifting every time Landon's hands shook. Hours turned into a night, and the waiting stretched like a taut string ready to snap. Jack found tasks where there were none. He noticed a flickering bulb above the nurse's station and replaced it with a spare he found in a storage closet. He brewed pots of bitter coffee when the machine sputtered dry, carrying mugs to exhausted nurses who smiled at him with weary gratitude. He swept the hallway where muddy boots had tracked in rain, the scrape of the broom a rhythm against the silence. No one asked him to do these things, but no one stopped him either. In his quiet service, Jack carved a space for himself, not through speeches, but through action. Emily grew tired but refused to sleep until Jack carried her to a bench, covering her with his jacket. Rex stood guard, his head lifting at every footstep, his body planted firmly between the child and the corridor. Landon, wide-eyed and restless, leaned against Rex, his fingers tangled in the thick fur, finding comfort in the warmth of the dog's presence. "He won't leave, will he?" Landon whispered once, his voice fragile. Jack knelt beside him, his hand firm on the boy's shoulder. "No," he said simply. "None of us will." The boy nodded, tears slipping silently down his cheeks as he leaned closer to Rex. The bikers watched Jack with quiet eyes. Diesel, one of the older riders with a weathered face and a scar across his jaw, approached him in the dim hours before dawn. "You don't have to do all this," Diesel muttered, his voice low, more observation than question. Jack only shrugged, his tired eyes steady. "I can't sit still," he answered. Diesel studied him for a moment, then nodded once, as if something unspoken had been confirmed. From that point on, none of them looked at Jack the same way. By the second day, the waiting had worn deep grooves into every face. Some had dozed off in chairs, others stared at the floor as though trying to will Cole's survival with sheer silence. Jack remained constant. He checked on Emily, he sat with Landon, he carried fresh cups of water to those too restless to move. When Landon's small body trembled with sobs, Jack lifted him onto his lap, steadying the boy with arms that once carried him from fire. Rex pressed close, his presence anchoring them both. Emily slipped her hand into Landon's, her innocence bridging a friendship born of shared fear. Then, at last, the tide shifted. A nurse appeared, her face pale but hopeful, and whispered news too low for the room to catch. Jack rose immediately, his steps carrying him to Cole's door where machines beeped like tired metronomes. Cole stirred faintly, his eyelids fluttering, his breath raspy but present. Jack stepped closer, Emily and Landon hovering behind him, Rex planted at the threshold like a sentinel. Cole's gaze focused slowly, landing first on Landon, then lifting to Jack. A ghost of a smile touched his lips as he rasped, "Still here?" Jack nodded once, his throat too tight to answer. Cole closed his eyes, a single tear slipping down his temple, the weight of relief heavier than any chain. Word spread quickly through the hall, a ripple of voices turning into hushed joy. The bikers filed in one by one, their eyes shining, their shoulders sagging with release. They looked at Jack differently now, not as an outsider who had stumbled into their world, but as a man who had stood when others faltered. No oaths were spoken, no ceremony performed, but their verdict was clear. A quiet decision passed from nod to nod, from one hardened face to another, until it reached the man himself. Jack Carter had earned his place, not by claim, but by constancy, not by words, but by the silent truth of his actions. As the sun broke through the hospital windows, spilling gold across the tired faces of those who had kept vigil, Jack sat with Emily curled against him, Rex at his feet, Landon smiling faintly for the first time in days. Cole slept, safe, alive, the storm receding. And in that fragile dawn, the angels gave Jack what no fire, no battle, no trial could take away. Their trust, their brotherhood, their unspoken promise that he was one of them now, forever. The hospital lights had barely dimmed from the long nights of vigil when Jack Carter quietly returned to the rhythm of his ordinary life. Riverbend's streets, washed clean by autumn rain, stretched calm and familiar, and Jack walked them without fanfare, his boots steady on cracked sidewalks that had carried him for years. He rose each dawn, brewed coffee in the chipped mug that had survived 2 deployments, and headed to the bus depot where he worked nights, his body moving with the discipline of routine. Emily, bright-eyed and endlessly curious, skipped beside him in the mornings, her backpack bouncing, while Rex, the faithful German shepherd, trotted close, his amber eyes sharp and protective. From the outside, they seemed like any small family holding to quiet simplicity, but for those who watched closely, there was something different now, an invisible weight of trust that Jack carried with every step. The fire had made him a local name, the hospital vigil had earned him a brotherhood, but Jack never leaned into the attention. He didn't tell the story at the diner or mention it to neighbors who offered handshakes. He only nodded, said little, and moved on. Yet it was this very silence that made him stand apart, because when trouble rose in Riverbend, people began to look for Jack. It wasn't because he wore colors or carried titles, but because he had shown without asking that he would not turn away. The first time came on a bitter evening when Mrs. Halloway, an elderly widow with silver hair and trembling hands, struggled to carry groceries up the icy steps of her porch. Jack stopped without hesitation, Emily rushing ahead to grab a bag, Rex pacing at their side. The woman smiled through tears, whispering that no one had helped her since her husband passed, and Jack only shook his head, saying, "You don't have to ask." We're here the days unfolded in much the same way. At the community center, where paint peeled from the walls and children's laughter echoed in thin hallways, Jack appeared with a toolbox, repairing broken hinges and patching leaks. Emily, small but determined, helped pass out coloring books to the younger kids, her blonde hair falling into her face as she crouched beside them with crayons. Rex patrolled the corridors, tolerated sticky hands tugging at his ears, and sat proudly as toddlers leaned against his broad frame. The center's director, a tired woman named Gloria, middle-aged with glasses slipping down her nose, shook Jack's hand with quiet gratitude. "You don't make speeches," she said softly, "but you make things better." Jack only smiled, but inside, he felt something stir, a reminder that service didn't end when uniforms were folded away. One late afternoon, word spread of a storm that had knocked out power across the poorer side of town. Streetlights blinked dark, refrigerators warmed, and families huddled in the cold. Jack loaded Emily into the truck, Rex leaping into the back, and drove through flooded streets with nothing more than lanterns and blankets from their own home. They stopped at house after house, sharing what little they had, lighting candles, checking on elderly residents who sat in shadowed rooms wrapped in coats. Emily's small voice carried cheer, her laughter breaking the tension, while Rex padded quietly behind, his nose nudging frightened children until they smiled. To those who received their help, it felt less like charity and more like family showing up at the right time. The bikers noticed, too. Members of Cole's circle began appearing at Jack's door, not in thunderous packs but in pairs, quietly asking if he needed tools, offering rides, or dropping off food when they knew Emily had school late. Jack never sought them out, but the bond that had begun in fire grew with each shared act of service. One evening, Diesel leaned against Jack's fence, arms crossed, his gravel voice carrying weight. "You don't wear the patch in public, but you live it better than most of us." Jack didn't reply, only looked at Rex rolling in the grass with Emily and Landon, their laughter carrying into the twilight. For him, that was answer enough. It wasn't always dramatic rescues or storms. Sometimes it was as simple as fixing a broken porch light for a neighbor working double shifts, or mending a fence so a single mother's children wouldn't wander too close to the road. Each time, Jack refused payment, shaking his head as Emily pressed cookies into people's hands instead. "We don't do it for thanks," he told her once as they drove home, the truck rattling on worn shocks. "We do it because no one should be left alone when they need help." Emily nodded, her small fingers petting Rex's thick fur, as if even at her young age she understood that lesson was worth more than gold. As weeks passed, Jack's presence became a kind of quiet anchor in Riverbend. The townsfolk began to whisper about him, not as the man from the fire, but as the man who always showed up. They saw Emily's bright smile and Rex's unwavering loyalty and felt hope that compassion still had a place in their weary town. Children pointed at Rex on the street, calling him a hero dog. Parents lowered their voices but admitted relief that someone like Jack lived among them. And though Jack never sought it, he became something larger than himself, a reminder that true strength was measured in kindness, not power. One Sunday morning, Riverbend held a small gathering in the park. It wasn't planned for him, but as families shared food and laughter under the shade of old oak trees, Jack, Emily, and Rex were greeted again and again with gratitude. Landon ran circles with Emily, their laughter carrying across the grass, while Rex lay beneath a bench, his chest rising and falling like a calm drumbeat. A man Jack barely knew approached him then, a factory worker, clothes stained with grease, eyes tired but earnest. "You don't know me," the man said. "But when my wife was sick, you fixed our sink and brought soup. I never said thank you, so thank you." Jack nodded, unable to find words, but his silence spoke volumes. The evening drew to a close with lanterns glowing across the park, and as Jack gathered Emily into his arms and called Rex to his side, he looked at the faces around him. Faces no longer marked only by hardship, but by connection. In their eyes, he saw not admiration, but something purer. Trust. And trust, Jack knew, was the rarest gift of all. He didn't need banners, he didn't need speeches. His reward was the laughter of his daughter, the loyalty of his dog, and the knowledge that in a town often overlooked by the world, one small family could still make a difference. By the time they walked home under the stars, Emily asleep against his shoulder, and Rex padding faithfully beside him, Jack understood that heroism wasn't about battles fought in fire or war. It was about the quiet choice to show up again and again for those who needed it most. And in Riverbend, that choice had made him something he never asked to be, but had quietly become a silent hero, living proof that the greatest strength lies in compassion. Sometimes the greatest heroes are not the ones who wear badges or make headlines, but the ones who choose to show up quietly, again and again, with compassion and sacrifice. Jack, Emily, and Rex remind us that every small act of kindness carries the power to change lives, even when no one is watching. If this story spoke to your heart, share it with someone who might need encouragement, write your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to hear more stories of silent heroes. May God bless you and your loved ones with strength, kindness, and peace today and always.